I'm at my limit. Please, you have to say something to him. I had reached the end of my patience.
What the hell out of the blue?
It's not out of the blue. I've asked you many times before, haven't I? You should have told him too. I had appealed to my husband to ask my brother-in-law to leave the house.
You are asking to kick my brother out of the house even though he has nowhere to go? How can you say such a thing when you are his sister-in-law?
That's right. You are really a scumbag. The one who came to me was my husband's mother. Both of them were talking to me as if it was my fault. This is a story of my own experience with a family member who was a total jerk. My name is Lisa. I married my current husband Mike when I was 28 years old. We met on an arranged marriage. It was my boss's recommendation. I had been devoted to karate since I was a child. When I was a student, love was a secondary concern. I spent every day in karate and struggled to balance it with my studies. Of course, after I entered the workforce, I had no desire to get married. But I had never been in love properly, and it was difficult for me to find a boyfriend. I didn't really know how to build a relationship with a man. My boss at work was concerned about me. He introduced me to my current husband, who was a good friend of his. My first impression of him was that he was a kind man. He was a government employee, but he seemed very calm, like a pacifist. I wanted to get married by the time I was 30, if possible. I took a liking to him, and I immediately accepted his offer of a relationship. The rest of our relationship went well, and it did not take long for us to fall in love with each other. I especially liked his honesty and kindness. I thought I might be able to make it with this man. After a while, he proposed to me, and I readily accepted. We were to be married. My parents, who are wealthy and owned several houses as vacation homes, gave me one of their houses.
You can choose any house you like.
I chose a house that was just right, not too big, not too small. It was a normal house, a little bigger than a normal house. It had enough room for a child in the future and a garden. It was convenient for transportation, and there were stores close by, so I chose this house. My husband, who usually doesn't show his emotions too much, said to me at that moment,
"Wow, it's amazing. Is it really okay to get such a splendid house?"
I remember my husband muttering apologetically. Our happy life was about to begin. I had no doubt in my mind. The wedding ceremony ended without incident, and our newlywed life began. A few months later, however, my father-in-law, who had been suffering from a chronic illness, passed away. My husband has one younger brother, but I never had a chance to see him because he was living and working in a factory in the suburbs. I myself met him for the first time at the wedding, and the next time was only at my father-in-law's funeral. With the death of my father-in-law, my mother-in-law was left alone at my in-law's house. My husband began to contact my mother-in-law frequently. Then, around the same time, my mother-in-law began to visit our home frequently. It is true that my husband was the older brother, and perhaps he felt responsible for her as the eldest son. It is not hard to understand why he was worried about his mother, who was left alone. However, I was busy with work at the time, and my home was the only place where I felt at ease. I was a little concerned that my mother-in-law was sitting there as if it was a matter of course when I came home. One day, after a few months of such routine, my husband said to me,
"Hey Lisa, what do you think about my mother moving in with us?"
"What?" I was puzzled with my husband's sudden comment. "What is this out of the blue? She's coming here so often already." When I said that, he replied,
"It must be hard for her to come all the way here every time. So why doesn't she just come and live with us?"
My husband said with a twinkle in his eye. It was as if he had just come up with the best idea of the lifetime. Wait a minute. I don't know how to respond when you say that out of the blue. We have our own lives to lead. I pleaded with him.
This house is too big for the two of us. We've got plenty of room. I think my mother would benefit in many ways if we lived together.
He did not listen to my opinion. After that, I did not react well, but my husband kept on talking. He told me he was worried about leaving his mom alone if anything happened to her. To be honest, I wasn't too keen on the idea, as we had just started our newlywed life. But if my husband was worried, I couldn't say no. While I was mulling over my answer, my mother-in-law sold her family home. I was half forced into a situation where I had to accept my mother-in-law. At first, I blamed my husband, who had taken the liberty of talking to her.
We don't have a family home anymore. She has no place to live, and I don't have a choice.
I lost all interest in talking back to him. After that, my life was mentally difficult. I was not harassed by what is commonly referred to as wife baiting, but I did receive a lot of criticism from my mother-in-law. You are the wife, you know. I hated it. You are married to my son. You are his wife, and you should serve your husband's family. She seems to have such an old-fashioned way of thinking. If I put my work first for a moment, she would say to me, "You are a wife. Please be more aware of that." She said this repeatedly. Because of this, after my mother-in-law came to town, I couldn't stand to be at home. Days at work became more and more frequent, as I had to work overtime. I was able to deal with the sarcastic comments from my mother-in-law in my own way every day. I was still able to live an ordinary life. That is until something like this happened. A few years later, my brother-in-law told me that he is quitting his job at the end of the year and coming back to his parents' house. My brother-in-law, who had been working as a living worker in the suburb for a long time and had never contacted us, suddenly reported this to me, my husband, and my mother-in-law. My husband and mother-in-law and I were all surprised at the suddenness of the situation. And there was something more we had to think about. The place he was coming back to had already been sold and was gone. There was no place for him to live as he pleased. My brother-in-law, who was ready to come back to his parents' house, blamed my husband and mother-in-law for selling the house without permission.
I didn't hear anything about you selling our house. Why did you decide this on your own?
My brother-in-law is what is commonly referred to as a mischievous person. He was not only flamboyant in appearance, but also rough in tone. To be honest, I didn't like that kind of person. I wanted to stay away from them as much as possible.
I'm sorry, but I was worried about Mom living in that house by herself. I thought you were going to live elsewhere and work for a long time.
My husband tried to calm him down, but my brother-in-law replied,
"Oh, I don't know. You can't just decide. Take responsibility, you shitty brother."
He yelled this to my husband. My husband was supposed to be the older brother, but he just freaked out at that comment from my brother-in-law. In the end, he couldn't say anything back. He just turned pale and looked down. In the first place, my father-in-law before his death had said,
"If something were to happen to me, I would leave everything to my wife."
These were his words. My brother-in-law left his parents' house without permission, worked in the suburb, and did not send money home. Does he have the right to blame his mother and his brother? I was thinking that, but in the end, we couldn't come to an agreement. My brother-in-law ended up living in our house on the condition that he would move out once he found another job. As expected, I didn't like it. I didn't want your brother to live with us too. Our living expenses are also increasing ever since your mother started living with us. I tried to complain.
I will make him leave once he finds a job. Just bear with it for now.
He responded to me. I couldn't just refuse and kick him out once he said that. I had no choice but to have even my brother-in-law move in with us. At this point, my mentality had been beaten to a pulp. But the really hard part came after this. First, about the condition that my brother-in-law had to live here until he found a job. After 3 months, my brother-in-law was still not looking for a job. He didn't look at job openings. He didn't go to job interviews. He just spent his days lounging around in the living room. He would stay in his room and play music loudly. He spent hours alone watching TV in the living room. My stress was building up more and more. To top it all off, I had just come home from work.
Is dinner ready yet? Do the laundry quickly, will you?
I was treated like a housekeeper. I could not stand it any longer and complained to my husband. Hey, about your brother. Can't you do something about the way he treats me like I'm his housekeeper?
Housekeeper? He thinks of you as his sister and adores you.
My husband laughed. He adores me? What do you mean? He orders me around. I'm treated like a housekeeper. I'm not a servant in this house. When I got so emotional, he said,
That's fine. Lisa is my wife.
My anger reached its peak. I'm your wife, not your brother's.
Oh, you're making too much noise. Enough of that. You're not his wife, but you're still his sister-in-law. Don't cause any trouble and just make it work, got it?
That's what he finally said to me. Frankly, I was disappointed in this statement of my husband. In this house, if I only put up with it, everything would be alright. That's what my husband seemed to think. There was nothing more I could say to my husband. After that, I stopped complaining to my husband about my brother-in-law and mother-in-law. Instead, I called my parents and complained many times. Both my father and mother told me to come home whenever I needed anything. With those words, I managed to endure life at home. But then, my brother-in-law did something terrible. When I returned home after work, I found a fire truck parked in front of my house. I approached it to see what was going on, but was stopped by a man holding a regulation line. Several firefighters came out of the front door, and my husband and mother-in-law thanked them. What happened? After following the departing fire truck with my eyes, I confronted my husband. What happened? Why was there a fire truck at our house? My husband looked at his mother and muttered awkwardly.
My brother was smoking a cigarette, and the cigarette butt caused a fire.
I was so surprised and angry that I let out that loud voice. They gave me the details, and apparently a cigarette butt caused a minor blight, and my mother-in-law panicked and called my husband and the fire department. Then why didn't she call me? I knew because my return home happened to coincide with a firefighter leaving. But if I had come home without knowing anything, would they have kept quiet? I asked them that, but they both remained silent. Irritated by the two of them, I hurried to my brother-in-law's room and opened the door without knocking.
You can at least knock.
I looked around the room, ignoring my brother-in-law, who was getting angry with me. I saw a large burn mark on the carpet just under the bed. Ever since his arrival, the whole house smelled of cigarettes, and even that was stressing me out. And to top it off, my favorite carpet was burned to a crisp. I had reached the end of my patience. I complained to my husband in front of my mother-in-law and brother-in-law. I've reached my limit. You need to say something too. My husband was horrified.
What's the matter with you all of a sudden?
Is all he said. It's not all of a sudden. I've asked you many times before, haven't I?
You should have made it clear to him too.
I appealed to my husband to ask my brother-in-law to leave the house. Then my husband sighed deeply and said in a tiresome tone,
You are asking me to kick my brother out of the house when he has no place to go. How can you say such a thing when you are his sister-in-law?
Yeah, you are his sister-in-law, so how can you say such a thing to him? You are terrible. The one who came at me was my husband's mother. Both of them were talking as if it was my fault. Why should I be blamed? After all, this is my precious house that I inherited from my father. Aside from my husband, my mother-in-law and brother-in-law, who came to live in the house afterwards without permission, are in a position to complain? For once, I couldn't back down. Get out of my house! That's what I told them.
You are kicking my brother out of the house? If you can't stand him, then you get out.
With that, my husband left the room. My brother-in-law was watching the situation with a grin on his face. I felt somewhat empty and went back to my room. The next day, when I came home from work, the key to the front door would not work. No matter how many times I tried, the keyhole didn't fit. And when I rang the intercom, there was no response. Then, a notification on my phone, alerting me to a text from my husband.
I changed the locks on the house over here. I will let you back in after you get your head straight.
That's what it said. Don't be silly. If you want to do that, then fine. I will get out. So I went back to my parents' house and explained this to my father and mother. After hearing what I had to say, my parents' face grew increasingly grim.
Leave the rest to your father.
My father consulted a lawyer he knew. Once that happened, things proceeded at a brisk pace. I sent a certification letter demanding alimony, divorce, and an order to move out the house. Then, in the presence of the lawyer, a meeting was set up at the house. As soon as we started talking, my husband said,
Divorce over something as trivial as this is ridiculous.
And my husband has refused to divorce me. However, when I said to him, if you don't agree to divorce, I don't care if we have to go to court. When I told him that, he gave up easily. Perhaps overwhelmed by the word court, my husband suddenly became quiet. However, when the subject of moving out of the house came up, he again began to raise his voice in protest.
This house is our home. I, your husband, have the right to own it too.
My husband looked down at me as if to say, I told you so. Then the lawyer said,
You have no right to this house.
Yes, this house was given to me by my father before we were married. From my husband's point of view, it was not even shared property. I could see the faces of my husband, the in-laws, turning paler and paler as they learned this. They probably thought that they would never be kicked out of the house seriously as expected. Their faces gradually turned pale.
Lisa, why don't we reconsider this divorce thing?
My husband said something convenient like that.
What do you want to do?
The lawyer asked me. Of course I'm getting a divorce. I will not change my mind. I said clearly. My husband must have thought there was nothing more he could do. We agreed to the divorce, and the divorce was finalized. Mike and his family moved out of the house. I'm sure Mike is doing his best to pay the alimony. I heard that the family of 3 moved into a shabby apartment. Naturally, my ex-mother-in-law and ex-brother-in-law, who could not live freely, became increasingly stressed. As for my ex-brother-in-law, he tried to release his stress outside the home. I hear that he was involved in an assault case against some thugs. Well, it's none of my business anymore. I got my house back in one piece and remodeled the room where my former brother-in-law used to live. The scorch marks on the floor that had been bothering me are now nicely gone, and my mood has brightened. Now my parents come to stay with me on weekends, and we are enjoying our days in our own way. I invited the lawyer, who helped me with this case, to dinner afterwards to thank him. Since then, we have been meeting regularly in private. My home has finally become stress-free. On holidays, I sometimes invite him over and treat him to a home-cooked meal. Perhaps one day, I will be able to live a married life again. With this thought in mind, I'm spending every day happily.